Rain poured relentlessly over the cobblestone streets of Paris, transforming elegant avenues into muddy rivers and narrow alleys into veritable torrents. It was the kind of day when the wealthy remained comfortably sheltered in their mansions, while the less fortunate braved the elements out of necessity rather than choice. Edward Montmorency, Duke of Valençay, walked at a leisurely pace under his black umbrella, indifferent to the commotion around him. At 40, he was one of the most powerful and wealthy men in France, though few would have recognized him in his current attire. A simple dark coat without ornaments, sturdy but ordinary boots, and none of the insignia of his rank. These incognito walks constituted his only pleasure, his only respite from the crushing responsibilities and rigid conventions that governed his existence. "Excuse me, sir. Would you have a coin for some bread?" The small voice pulled him from his thoughts. Looking down, he discovered a girl of about 8 years old, soaked to the bone, her worn clothes clinging to her frail body. Her large brown eyes in her pale face stared at him with a mixture of hope and resignation, as if she already expected to be turned away. "Are you all alone, little one?" he asked, surprised to see such a young child begging in such weather. "No, sir. My mother is sick in bed, and my little brother too. I've been trying to find something to eat since this morning." Something in her dignity, the way she stood straight despite her drenched clothes, the absence of whining in her request, touched Edward. He was accustomed to solicitations in the streets of Paris and could recognize fabricated stories from genuine distress. This child, he was certain, was not lying. "What's your name?" "Lucy, sir." "Well, Lucy, I'm not going to give you a coin." He saw disappointment darken the child's face before adding, "I'm going to do better than that. Show me where you live, and I'll make sure your family and you have more than just a piece of bread." Suspicion immediately replaced disappointment. In Lucy's eyes, too many street children knew the dangers that could lurk behind overly generous adults. "I don't want to trouble you, sir. Just a coin will do." Edward understood her reluctance and inwardly approved. "You're right to be careful," he said gently. "But I assure you my intentions are honorable." He thought for a moment, then added, "Here's what we'll do. Lead me to the bakery nearest your home. I'll buy bread and other provisions, and you can take them to your family yourself." The proposal seemed to reassure Lucy, whose face brightened slightly. "Mr. Fournier's bakery is 2 streets away, near my house." "Perfect. Here, come under my umbrella. You're wet enough as it is." Lucy hesitated a moment before accepting his protection from the pouring rain. They walked in silence through the alleys of the Saint-Antoine district, one of the poorest in Paris. Edward discreetly observed his young companion, noting her bare feet in oversized clogs, probably inherited, and the way she wrapped her arms against her chest to retain some warmth. Fournier's bakery was a modest shop whose faded storefront nevertheless proclaimed "Best bread in Paris" in once gilded letters. A bell tinkled when they entered, welcomed by the comforting warmth of the ovens and the irresistible aroma of fresh bread. "Good morning, Mr. Fournier," Lucy greeted timidly. The baker, a corpulent man with powerful arms and a ruddy face, gave the child a warm smile before casting an inquiring glance toward Edward. "Lucy, my little one, is your mother better?" "No, sir. She's still in bed with a fever, and now Thomas is sick too." The baker shook his head sympathetically. "These winter fevers never seem to end this year. And who is this gentleman accompanying?" "You?" Before Lucy could answer, Edward stepped forward. "Just a passer-by who wishes to help. I would like to buy bread and some provisions for this family, if you would be so kind." "Of course, sir," the baker agreed, his expression reflecting a mixture of surprise and approval. "What exactly would you like?" "Give me 2 of your largest loaves, a dozen rolls, and if you have any brioches or pastries, add a few of those. Sick children appreciate sweets." While Mr. Fournier gathered the order, Edward turned to Lucy. "Is there a grocery store nearby? You'll need more than bread." Mrs. Voisin keeps a grocery just across the street, Lucy replied, increasingly intrigued by this generous stranger. After paying the baker, leaving him astonished by the amount, and far exceeding the order, Edward led Lucy to the grocery store. There he bought cheese, eggs, butter, milk, a few apples, and even a small pot of honey. At the neighbouring butcher shop, he added a whole chicken and a piece of beef for a strengthening broth. With arms laden with packages that the butcher and grocer had carefully wrapped to protect from the rain, they resumed their journey, Lucy, guiding Edward through a maze of narrow alleys to a dilapidated building with leprous walls. "This is where I live, sir," she said, stopping before a low door. On the 4th floor, Edward considered the packages and the steep, dark staircase ahead. "I'll help you carry all this up. These provisions are too heavy for you alone." Lucy nodded gratefully, and they began the ascent of the creaking staircase. The smell of dampness and stuffiness intensified with each floor, mixed with cooking odours and occasional cries of children from different lodgings. Reaching the 4th floor, Lucy stopped before a door whose paint was peeling. "It's here," she whispered before entering. Without knocking, the single room that constituted their lodging was small but clean despite the obvious poverty. A bed occupied one corner, where a woman with a hollow face rested. A young boy of about 5 years old nestled against her. A rickety table, 2 chairs, a worn trunk, and a small wood stove constituted all the furniture. The woman opened feverish eyes at their entrance. "Lucy, who's with you?" Her voice was weak but tinged with concern. "Good day, madam," Edward greeted respectfully, placing his packages on the table. "Your daughter asked me for a coin for bread, but I thought you might need more than that." The woman tried to sit up, visibly embarrassed. "Lucy, you shouldn't have." "Sir, I am confused. We don't usually beg, but with this illness—" The baker, a corpulent man with powerful arms and a ruddy face, gave the child a warm smile before casting an inquiring glance toward Edward. "Lucy, my little one, is your mother better?" "No, sir. She's still in bed with a fever. And now Thomas is sick too." The baker shook his head sympathetically. "These winter fevers never seem to end this year." "And who is this gentleman accompanying you?" Before Lucy could answer, Edward stepped forward. "Just a passer-by who wishes to help. I would like to buy bread and some provisions for this family, if you would be so kind." "Of course, sir," the baker agreed, his expression reflecting a mixture of surprise and approval. "What exactly would you like?" "Give me 2 of your largest loaves, a dozen rolls, and if you have any brioches or pastries, add a few of those. Sick children appreciate sweets." While Mr. Fournier gathered the order, Edward turned to Lucy. "Is there a grocery store nearby? You'll need more than bread." "Mrs. Voisin keeps a grocery just across the street," Lucy replied, increasingly intrigued by this generous stranger. After paying the baker, leaving him astonished by the amount, far exceeding the order, Edward led Lucy to the grocery store. There he bought cheese, eggs, butter, milk, a few apples, and even a small pot of honey. At the neighbouring butcher shop, he added a whole chicken and a piece of beef for a strengthening broth. With arms laden with packages that the butcher and grocer had carefully wrapped to protect from the rain, they resumed their journey, Lucy guiding Edward through a maze of narrow alleys to a dilapidated building with leprous walls. "This is where I live, sir," she said, stopping before a low door. On the 4th floor, Edward considered the packages and the steep, dark staircase ahead. "I'll help you carry all this up. These provisions are too heavy for you alone." Lucy nodded gratefully, and they began the ascent of the creaking staircase. The smell of dampness and stuffiness intensified with each floor, mixed with cooking odours and occasional cries of children from different lodgings. Reaching the 4th floor, Lucy stopped before a door whose paint was peeling. "It's here," she whispered before entering. Without knocking, The single room that constituted their lodging was small but clean, despite the obvious poverty. A bed occupied one corner, where a woman with a hollow face rested. A young boy of about 5 years old nestled against her. A rickety table, 2 chairs, a worn trunk, and a small wood stove constituted all the furniture. The woman opened feverish eyes at their entrance. "Lucy, who's with you?" Her voice was weak but tinged with concern. "Good day, madam," Edward greeted respectfully, placing his packages on the table. "Your daughter asked me for a coin for bread, but I thought you might need more than that." The woman tried to sit up, visibly embarrassed. "Lucy, you shouldn't have—" "Sir, I am confused. We don't usually beg, but with this illness—" "Don't worry, Mrs." Edward let his sentence trail off, realizing he didn't know their family name. "Mercer," the woman weakly completed. "I am Helen Mercer, and you are—" "Edward," he replied simply, deliberately omitting his title and family name. "I've brought enough food to nourish you for a few days. Your daughter told me you were unwell, as well as your son." "Thomas caught the same fever as me," Helen confirmed, stroking the hair of the sleeping child. "And my husband—" Her voice broke. "My husband left us last winter. He was a carpenter, an accident at a construction site." "I understand," Edward said softly, not wishing to force her to relive painful memories. "Have you consulted a doctor for this fever?" Helen gave a bitter laugh. "Doctors are expensive, sir. I already struggle to pay the rent for this hovel, since I can no longer do my sewing work." Edward nodded, understanding the situation more clearly. A widow with 2 young children, living on needlework, now unable to work due to illness. A common story in the poor districts of Paris. "I know a good doctor," he said after a moment's reflection. "I'll send him to see you today." "Sir, that's too much generosity," Helen weakly protested. "We can never repay you." "There's no question of repayment, Mrs. Mercer. Let's just say I was touched by your daughter's courage, and I have the means to help." He turned to Lucy, who was already eagerly unpacking the provisions with wonder in her eyes. "Lucy, can you heat some water to prepare a broth for your mother and brother?" The child nodded vigorously, obviously accustomed to caring for her family despite her young age. While she busied herself around the stove, Edward approached the bed and discreetly examined the condition of the mother and child. Their pale complexion and fever-flushed cheeks confirmed the seriousness of their condition, though nothing suggested a more dangerous illness than winter influenza, worsened by malnutrition and cold. "I must leave you now," he announced after helping Lucy organize the provisions. "But I'll return tomorrow to ensure the doctor has visited and that you have everything you need." "Why are you doing this, sir?" Helen asked, confusion evident in her feverish gaze. "You don't even know us." Edward smiled slightly. "Let's say I've been in your place before, Mrs. Mercer. Not exactly, of course, but I've known hunger and uncertainty about tomorrow." This wasn't strictly true. The Duke of Valence was born into privilege, but he had indeed experienced difficult times during the Revolution, when his family had to flee France, leaving everything behind. Before leaving, he discreetly slipped a purse containing enough money to cover a month's rent into the pocket of Lucy's apron as she accompanied him to the door. "This is for your rent and other necessities," he murmured. "Don't show it to your mother right away. She might refuse out of pride. Wait for the right moment." Lucy's eyes widened when she felt the weight of the purse. "Thank you, Mr. Edward," she whispered fervently. "You're like an angel sent from heaven." "No, just a man doing what he can," he replied, affectionately ruffling her hair. "See you tomorrow, Lucy." As he descended the dark staircase, Edward felt an unusual warmth in his chest. He who spent his days surrounded by courtiers and interested solicitors had almost forgotten the simple satisfaction of helping someone in need without expecting anything in return. Upon his return to his mansion in the Saint-Germain district, He immediately sent for his personal physician, Dr. Moreau, and asked him to go directly to the Mercers. He also gave instructions to his steward for a delivery of firewood to be made to the address he provided, as well as blankets and warm clothes for the family. That night, lying in his canopied bed with fine linen sheets, the Duke of Valençay slept more peacefully than he had in a long time, eager to return to see the little family the next day. What he couldn't know was that his simple act of kindness would trigger a series of events that would disrupt his well-ordered life in a way he could never have imagined. The next morning, Edward awoke with unusual energy. Typically burdened by social obligations and the responsibilities of managing his numerous estates, he rarely awaited dawn with impatience. Yet, on this day, he was up before his valet even came. To open the curtains of his chamber, "Your Grace seems particularly alert this morning," the servant cautiously remarked as he presented the carefully prepared clothes for the day. "Indeed, Laurent," Edward replied with a slight smile. "I have some personal matters to attend to this morning before my usual appointments. Prepare a simple outfit for me. I wish to go unnoticed." Laurent, who had served the Duke for over 15 years, knew how to recognize these moments when his master desired to briefly escape the constraints of his rank. Without asking questions, he substituted the originally planned court attire for a more discreet ensemble, though still of impeccable quality. After a light breakfast, Edward summoned Dr. Moreau, who had promised to stop by the mansion before his morning visits. "How did you find the Mercer family?" he asked as soon as the doctor was shown into his private study. Dr. Moreau, a middle-aged man with a perceptive gaze, respectfully inclined his head. "Their condition is concerning, Your Grace, though not desperate. The mother and young boy suffer from a strong influenza, aggravated by malnutrition and cold. I left medications and gave precise instructions to the little girl, who seems remarkably responsible for her age. And their lodging, their general conditions? Miserable, as one might expect in that neighborhood. However, I was surprised by the cleanliness of the place despite the obvious destitution." The doctor hesitated a moment before adding, "If I may, Your Grace, this family is not the type to beg." The mother profusely apologized for the inconvenience, insisting she would repay the cost of my visit as soon as she could resume her work. Edward nodded, satisfied to see his intuition confirmed. "I suspected as much. Is there anything else I can do to improve their immediate situation?" "Regular, nourishing food, adequate heating, and possibly an apothecary to renew the remedies I prescribed. With these elements and some rest, they should recover completely within 2 weeks." "Excellent. Thank you, Doctor. Please continue to visit them daily until their complete recovery. Send me your bills as usual." After the doctor's departure, Edward went to the kitchens to request that a food basket be prepared. Strengthening broth, fresh bread, tender meats easy to digest, and some sweets for the children. While waiting for its preparation, he returned to his study, where his secretary had laid out the day's correspondence. Among the numerous letters and invitations, one particular envelope caught his attention. Sealed with the coat of arms of the Montforts, one of the oldest and most powerful families in France. "The Count of Montfort," he murmured in surprise. What could he want from me after all these years? The Count and he had frequented the same circles in their youth, before the Revolution, but their paths had separated when the Montmorencies fled to England, while the Montforts remained in France, miraculously managing to keep their heads and part of their property. Since Edward's return to France after Napoleon's fall, they had occasionally crossed paths at official events, exchanging the usual pleasantries, but nothing more. Breaking the wax seal, Edward unfolded the letter and quickly scanned its contents. It was an invitation to a private dinner, phrased in unusually warm terms for a simple social courtesy. "Would be honored by your presence. Personal matter of the highest importance. Absolute discretion appreciated. The cryptic style piqued Edward's curiosity, but he didn't have the leisure to dwell on it further. The basket for the Mercers was ready, and he had promised Lucy he would return, entrusting the letter to his secretary with instructions to accept the invitation for the following week. He left his mansion through a side entrance, taking less frequented streets to reach the Saint-Antoine district. The day was markedly milder than the previous one. A pale winter sun pierced through the clouds, timidly warming the streets still damp with rain. Edward noticed as he approached the Mercer's building that the pile of wood he had ordered had been delivered and carefully stacked under a small protective awning. The ascent of 4 floors, basket in hand, reminded him how much his privileged life had distanced him from the daily realities of the majority of his compatriots. Arriving at the Mercer's door, slightly out of breath, he knocked gently. The door opened almost immediately, revealing Lucy, whose face lit up at the sight of him. "Mr. Edward, you came back." As promised, he smiled, handing her the basket. "How are your mother and brother today?" "A little better. The doctor said the medicine would start working today, and Mama managed to eat some broth this morning." She stepped aside to let him enter, adding in a low voice, "She cried when she saw all the firewood and blankets you sent. She said angels really did exist." Edward entered the small room, immediately noticing the improvements from the day before. A fire gently roared in the stove, diffusing a welcome warmth. The thick blankets he had sent replaced the thin, worn sheets. On the bed, and Thomas, though still pale, was sitting propped against pillows, fascinated by a picture book that had accompanied the clothes. Helen Mercer tried to sit up at his entrance, but Edward stopped her with a gesture. "Don't trouble yourself, madam. I simply came to see if the doctor had visited, and if you had everything you need." "Sir, your generosity overwhelms us," Helen began, her eyes bright with contained emotion. "We can never thank you enough. The doctor, the wood, the blankets, and now this new food. It's too much." "It's nothing that can't be easily replaced," Edward replied, taking a seat on one of the rickety chairs. "Dr. Moreau assured me you will recover completely with rest and good nutrition." "He's a remarkable doctor," Helen agreed. "So patient and attentive. He even took the time to examine Lucy's eyes when she mentioned she sometimes had trouble seeing the blackboard at school." Edward turned to the little girl, who was enthusiastically unpacking the contents of the basket. "You go to school, Lucy?" "Yes, sir. To the Sisters of Charity school. They take poor girls for free. I go every day except when Mama needs me at home. She's very gifted," Helen proudly interjected despite her weakness. "Sister Marie-Thérèse says she has a talent for letters. She already reads better than many older children." "Really?" Edward examined Lucy with renewed interest. Education for poor girls was rare, and those who showed particular aptitudes even rarer. "Perhaps you could read something to me, Lucy." The little girl blushed with pleasure at this attention. "I only have my school books, sir." "Those will do perfectly." While Lucy looked for her reading book under her mother's fond gaze, Edward inquired more precisely about Helen and Thomas's health. The widow, still weak but manifestly relieved by the unexpected help, told him about her work as a seamstress for several fashion shops in the Marais district, and her hopes to resume her activities the following week. "The landlord threatens to evict us if the rent isn't paid by the end of the month," she confided in a low voice so the children wouldn't hear. "With this illness, I haven't been able to work for almost 2 weeks." "Don't worry about that," Edward reassured her. "Your rent is paid for the month." Helen's eyes widened in surprise. "How?" "I left enough with Lucy yesterday," he explained simply. "She was probably waiting for the right moment to tell you." The glimmer of pride that crossed Helen's gaze confirmed to Edward that he had been right to respect her dignity by not offering her the money directly. This woman was not the type to easily accept charity, even in the most desperate circumstances. The afternoon passed quietly. Edward listened to Lucy read several passages from her schoolbook, genuinely impressed by her fluency and advanced understanding. For her age, he even shared a simple meal with the family, broth and fresh bread, finding in this simplicity a satisfaction that no aristocratic feast had ever given him. As he prepared to leave, promising to return the day after next to check on their progress, an unusual commotion was heard in the street below. Surprised exclamations, the characteristic sound of hooves on cobblestones, and the distinctive rolling of a carriage, an unusual sound in this narrow alley where only carts and occasionally the most modest hackneys ventured. Curious, Edward approached the small window, slightly pulling back the worn curtain. What he saw froze him in place. Below, attracting all the gazes of the neighborhood residents, stood a sumptuous golden carriage with immediately recognizable coat of arms, those of the Montforts. 2 footmen in ceremonial livery stood on either side of the ornate door, while a third questioned a neighbor who was pointing toward the very building where Edward was. "What is it?" asked Lucy, slipping to his side to look. "Oh, how beautiful! It looks like a fairy tale carriage." Edward stepped away from the window, his mind racing. How could the Count of Montfort know he was here? And why come looking for him with such pomp, thus revealing his identity that he had carefully concealed? He had no time to think further. Heavy steps resonated in the stairwell, followed by authoritative knocks at the door. Lucy, innocent of any suspicion, went to open it. A man in sumptuous livery bowed deeply as soon as his gaze fell on Edward. "Your Grace," he said respectfully, provoking stifled exclamations from Helen and a confused look from Lucy. "The Count of Montfort presents his respects and requests the honor of an immediate audience with you. His carriage awaits below." A stunned silence followed this announcement. Lucy was the first to break it, slowly turning toward Edward with wide eyes. "Your Grace?" she repeated, incredulous. Edward sighed deeply. His little haven of simplicity and sincerity had just shattered. "Yes, Lucy, I am Edward Montmorency, Duke of Valençay." He turned to the footman. "Tell the Count I will join him momentarily." When the servant had withdrawn with another bow, Edward faced the Mercer family, now silent and manifestly uncomfortable. "I beg your forgiveness for this omission," he said softly. "I didn't wish to deceive you, simply to help you without the weight of formalities that usually accompany my title." "A duke," Helen murmured, visibly mortified. "We treated a duke like a simple visitor. I had you sit on this rickety chair, eat from our chipped bowls." "And it was perfect that way," Edward gently interrupted. "These moments of simplicity and authenticity are precious to me, Mrs. Mercer." Lucy, who had observed the exchange in silence, approached Edward timidly. "Does this mean you won't come back to see us?" she asked, a note of sadness in her voice. Touched by this sincere concern, Edward knelt to be at the child's level. "Of course I'll come back, Lucy. My promise still stands. It's not my title that defines who I am, but my actions." Rising, he added for Helen's benefit, "I must now join the Count, but I will return the day after tomorrow as agreed. In the meantime, Dr. Moreau will continue his daily visits." Helen, still in shock, could only weakly nod. Edward saluted her with a slight nod of his head before taking his leave, descending the stairs with a strange sensation of loss. These few hours spent in this humble dwelling had been more authentic, more invigorating than entire months in the gilded salons he usually frequented. The Montfort's carriage waited, still attracting a crowd of onlookers. As soon as Edward appeared on the threshold of the building, the door opened, revealing the Count in person, an imposing man in his 50s, with aristocratic features accentuated by a carefully maintained moustache. "My dear Valençay," he exclaimed, descending to greet him with surprising familiarity. "What a treasure hunt you've led me on. I had to visit 3 bakeries before finding the one that had seen a gentleman matching your description in the company of a little girl yesterday. Montfort, Edward greeted him with polite reserve. Your appearance is, to say the least, unexpected and spectacular, he added, indicating the golden carriage and the footman in full dress that attracted all eyes. The Count made a negligent gesture with his hand. The urgency of the situation didn't allow for discretion, my friend. We must speak immediately. Please get in. Intrigued, despite his annoyance, Edward entered the carriage. Noticing Lucy watching the scene from the 4th-floor window, he gave her a small wave before the door closed behind him. The interior of the vehicle was as luxurious as the exterior suggested, seats upholstered in crimson velvet, finely carved woodwork, and even small crystal lanterns that diffused a soft light. The Count took his place opposite Edward, his expression changing from affected joviality to an almost grave seriousness. "Forgive this intrusion into your charitable activity," he began, as the carriage set in motion. "But the matter that concerns me couldn't wait until next week. What exactly is it about?" Edward asked, increasingly intrigued by this mystery. The Count hesitated, seemingly searching for words, unusual for this man known for his assurance in all circumstances. "It's about the little girl," he finally said. "The one who accompanied you yesterday, the one you just visited." Edward imperceptibly stiffened. "Lucy Mercer? What could a child from the poor districts possibly have to do with the Count of Montfort?" "Everything," the Count replied simply, "because this child, if my intuition is correct, is my granddaughter." The silence that followed this declaration seemed almost tangible. Edward stared at his interlocutor, searching his features for a trace of jest or madness. He found only the gravity of a man confronted with an overwhelming truth. "Your granddaughter," he finally repeated. "How is that possible?" The Count sighed deeply, his gaze momentarily lost in the past. "My eldest son, Henry, disappeared nearly 9 years ago. A scandal barely hushed up. He had apparently seduced a young woman of modest condition and married her in secret against my will. When I discovered this misalliance, I reacted with all the harshness of wounded pride. I disinherited him, cut off all financial support." The Count paused, visibly troubled by his own memories. "Henry had character. He refused to renounce his wife as I demanded, and disappeared into the lower districts of Paris. All my searches to find him failed. 3 years later, we learned he had died in a construction site accident. He, the son of one of the richest men in France, reduced to working as a simple carpenter." Edward was beginning to understand, mentally connecting the pieces of the puzzle. "And you think the widow Mercer is my son's wife?" "Yes. The name matches. Henry had taken the name Mercer, his mother's, to escape my searches. And the little girl, how old is she exactly?" 8, I believe. "That corresponds perfectly. She would have been born shortly after their disappearance." The Count leaned forward, his gaze suddenly intense. "What is she like? Does she have our family's eyes, the characteristic chin of the Montforts?" Edward reflected, visualizing Lucy's face. Now that he thought about it, there was indeed something familiar in her features, the particular shape of her eyes, the pronounced arch of her eyebrows. Characteristics he had observed in several generations of Montforts in family portraits displayed in their homes. "It's possible," he admitted. "There is a certain resemblance. But to state with certainty from that—" "I am convinced," interrupted the Count with fervor. "Providence guided you to this child, Valençay, you among all the passers-by in Paris. It's a sign of destiny." Edward was not a man to believe in signs of destiny, but the coincidence was indeed troubling. "What do you plan to do now? If Lucy is truly your granddaughter?" The Count's face animated with new determination. "Bring her back to her legitimate and place, of course. She's a Montfort, the child of my eldest son. Her place is in our family, with all the privileges and education that her rank demands." "And her mother?" Edward gently asked. "Helen Mercer has raised this child alone for 5 years, since her husband's death. She loves her deeply." A flash of hesitation crossed the Count's gaze before his expression hardened again. "Generous financial arrangements will be proposed. Of course, a comfortable pension, perhaps even a small property in the countryside. She will understand that it's in the child's interest." Edward wasn't so sure. The maternal love he had observed in Helen Mercer didn't seem the type to be appeased by material compensations, however generous they might be. "I advise you caution and delicacy, Montfort," he finally said. "These people have already suffered greatly, and if your intuition is correct, you bear some responsibility for their difficulties." The Count recoiled, as if stung by this remark, before a shadow of guilt crossed his face. "You're right," he admitted reluctantly. "My pride has caused much suffering. I failed to recognize true love when my son found it, blinded by considerations of rank and propriety." The carriage slowed, entering the courtyard of the Montfort's mansion, a residence almost as imposing as the Duke's, testifying to the fortune and influence of this ancient family. "Would you agree to help me, Valençay?" the Count suddenly asked as the vehicle came to a stop. "These people know you, trust you. Your presence could facilitate the negotiations." Edward considered the request gravely. He thought of little Lucy, of her vivacity of spirit, her courage in the face of adversity. He thought of Helen Mercer, a courageous widow fighting against poverty to offer a future to her children, and he thought of little Thomas, already deprived of a father, now risking losing his sister too. "I accept," he finally said, "but on one condition, that you consider all possibilities, including that of leaving Lucy with her mother, while ensuring her education and well-being." The Count seemed about to protest, but reconsidered. "You have my word that I will examine each option with an open mind." He extended his hand to Edward. "Do I have your word that you will help me establish the truth about this child?" Edward shook the offered hand, sealing an agreement that would transform far more lives than he could imagine at this moment. "You have it," he replied simply. He left the golden carriage under the curious gaze of the Montfort's servants. Edward couldn't help but think about the irony of fate. He who had sought a moment of simplicity by helping a hungry child now found himself at the center of an aristocratic family drama with potentially immense ramifications. But deep down, wasn't this precisely what he had always sought in his incognito? Walks? Not simply to escape his rank, but to find the very essence of humanity, those authentic connections that transcend social barriers and reveal who we truly are beyond titles and privileges. The next day already promised to be one that would forever change the destiny of the little Mercer family, and perhaps, in a way he did not yet suspect, his own as well. If you enjoyed this touching story of unlikely encounters and intertwined destinies, don't forget to subscribe to our channel to discover other captivating tales where the generosity of the heart transcends social barriers. Our next story will transport you to Victorian England, where a young governess will discover that the child in her charge is actually her own long-lost nephew. Subscribe now to not miss any of these stories that warm the soul and remind us of the beauty of human bonds that defy all conventions.